Welcome to a special episode of Political Currency with Ed Balls and George Osborne. This is Inside the Room, the Coalition Talks, a deep dive into a particular momentous period of British political history, a time in which both of us were participants in these big unfolding events, a period which we think actually is really important to understand if you want to understand what's going on today in British politics.
So we're taking you back to 5 days in May 2010. And those are the days between the general election of the 6th of May and the formation of the first coalition government in modern British history on the 11th of May. And that's relevant not only because it's an interesting bit of history, but of course, by the end of 2024, we might have another hung parliament. And our political successors might be facing the same choices that we faced back then. Let's remind ourselves what happened on Tuesday, the 11th of May, 2010.
My constitutional duty is to make sure that a government can be formed following last Thursday's general election. I've informed the Queen's private secretary that it's my intention to tender my resignation to the Queen. In the event that the Queen accepts, I shall advise her to invite the Leader of the Opposition to seek to form a government. I wish the next Prime Minister well as he makes the important choices for the future.
Here he is, our new Prime Minister.
Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a new government, and I have accepted. Our country has a hung parliament where no party has an overall majority, and we have some deep and pressing problems. A huge deficit, deep social problems, and a political system in need of reform. For those reasons, I aim to form a proper and full coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats.
So George's mate David Cameron becomes Prime Minister. My old boss Gordon Brown bows out after a long period at the top of British politics. That was after 5 days of argument and debate, but also negotiation, starting on the Thursday evening. A very unusual period, not something that we'd seen in our adult lifetimes. The formation of a coalition, the first since the wartime coalition of the Second World War, actually the first negotiated coalition in peacetime since 1918. Normally, on general election night, you go to bed and wake up in the morning to find who is the new Prime Minister. But when this exit poll dropped on Thursday, the 6th of May, nothing was certain.
10 o'clock, and this is what we're saying. It's going to be a hung parliament with the Conservatives as the largest party.
All of us should show a degree of humility at this stage.
Well, it's very strange.
If it is correct, I think what it does show is a clear rejection of Gordon
I don't
Brown.
think there's any question at all of Labour being able to continue in office. This is a massive rejection of the Labour Party. So I find it extraordinary listening to those Labour politicians on your programme.
The first question is, can the Prime Minister form a government? And Gordon Brown's the Prime Minister. So I think we have to wait and see, Jeremy.
What did you think when the exit poll dropped?
Well, I wasn't completely surprised, partly because the exit poll had been leaked to us about 30 minutes earlier. And I was up in my house in the Peak District and we'd had a conference call. This was all pre-Zoom days and Microsoft Teams and all that. So it was just a regular telephone conference call with David Cameron and his key advisors. And we were discussing how to handle things. And to be honest, in the couple of weeks leading up to the general election, we had begun, David and I, to think this was a pretty likely result and started to do some preparation. But where were you on the night?
I was at home in Castleford with a vet. We'd both come back from the final hours of our campaigns. And we both thought the Conservatives would win a majority. Although that wasn't certain. I'd spent a couple of hours that evening writing 4 different speeches for my count, whether there was a hung parliament or a Tory majority, and whether I won my seat and whether I lost my seat, because the hung parliament where I lost was not the one I was expecting. But a Tory majority, I could have lost my seat. I think that we were surprised there wasn't a Tory majority, in particular surprised that the Liberal Democrat vote wasn't as good as we expected. Nick Clegg had a very strong campaign. We thought the Liberal Democrats would win more seats. In fact, the number of seats they won fell on that night. But fundamentally, for us, it didn't change anything. We'd been in power for 13 years. We assumed we were going to lose, and we lost. We assumed as cabinet ministers our time in government had ended. And when the exit poll dropped, The question was, well, exactly how will Cameron govern? But was he going to be the Prime Minister? As far as we were concerned, definitely.
So I started off the evening feeling quite calm, even though it was a hung parliament. And I have to say, over the following 5 days, it got a lot more panicky. But we've got a guest on our show, have we not? For the first time, we've got a guest in the studio, and that is someone else who was watching the exit poll, someone else who was just been re-elected to Parliament, and that was the Liberal Democrat MP, very good friend of mine now, not such a good friend back then, Danny Alexander. Sir Danny Alexander, who has flown in from his important government job in Beijing.
Especially to be with us.
Especially, we believe at least, to be with us in our studio in Shoreditch. Danny, very, very good to see you.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I can say this was not the only reason for me to fly in, but it was definitely one of them.
And where were you that night when you saw the exit poll? I mean, Nick Clegg had stormed the debates. Everybody thought he'd had a great campaign. You must have thought you were going to see the number of Lib Dem seats go up. So what was the reaction when the exit poll dropped?
So I was in Inverness. I'd been, campaigning as we Lib Dems do till the last second before the polls closed, and I think I was probably in the hotel catching a bit of rest and saw the exit poll and spoke to Nick about it. I think our feeling was exactly like you said. We'd expected to win a few more seats. And of course, you don't know until the result actually comes. But still, there was a wee bit of disappointment from that point of view. But at the same time, we could see with the hung parliament, there was an opportunity. And it was an opportunity that we'd been preparing for the previous 6 months or so. We'll come to it, but the team that was doing the negotiating had also been a team doing the preparation. I wrote the manifesto. I was in charge of that team. And so we'd been kind of wargaming different options for 6 months on and off up until polling day.
So you were much better prepared than either of us were, although we in the Conservatives had been doing a bit of preparation. I'd been asked by David Cameron with Oliver Letwin, one of my colleagues, and David Cameron's Chief of Staff, Ed Llewellyn, who's now our ambassador to Italy these days, to think through just a couple of weeks before the election what a hung parliament might look like. But let's take us now to the first full day. So we've had the exit poll. We've all been re-elected as MPs around this table. And we all make our way back to London.
I was one of the first to arrive because I got the 6:30 flight from Inverness. It was that or not arriving at all on the Friday.
Right. So here we are. It's Friday the 7th of May. And let's remind ourselves of the news headlines this day.
I want to make a big, open and comprehensive offer to the Liberal Democrats.
David Cameron offers a deal to Nick Clegg after the general election ends in a hung parliament. Mr. Clegg says he will listen to what the Conservatives have to offer.
It is now for the Conservative Party to prove that it is capable of seeking to govern in the national interest.
But the man with the keys to number 10 is Gordon Brown, still Prime Minister and now waiting for others to decide his fate.
Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg should clearly be entitled to take as much time as they feel necessary. For my part, I should make clear that I would be willing to see any of the party leaders.
We'll have all the details of this remarkable election result.
So let's start in Downing Street. Let's start with Gordon Brown. What's the mood like there? I mean, presumably people, as you were saying just now, Ed, were expecting to have left by this point, and yet you all suddenly find yourselves back in the building, working out what to do next. But what's the mood like, and what's Gordon's mood like? You worked with him for 20 odd years. How's he feeling about things?
I think Gordon had a big job to persuade people that this wasn't all over. I mean, a lot of people had been on the TV overnight, Thursday into Friday. David Blunkett famously saying that Labour's lost and that's it. Gordon rang me and said, "You've got to come down to London because, there's issues to sort out." And I said, "Well, really? Because isn't it all done?" But he was talking a lot to Andrew Adonis, who was persuading him. Andrew Adonis, former SDP campaigner, close to the Liberal Democrats, had become a cabinet minister in the Brown government. And he was saying, constitutionally, there is a choice here. And don't listen to all those people saying that Labour's lost, that it's about leaving in a dignified way. It's still all to play for. the Liberal Democrats won't be able to go into a coalition with the Conservatives. That's too much of a break from the last 100 years of history. And I think Gordon's mindset was that he had been taking the country through the financial crisis and he wanted to finish that job. And he was thinking, well, both duty and constitutional propriety meant he couldn't just walk away from that if there was a possibility that he might need to do more. But as I said, lots of scepticism around. Interestingly, his staff members, when they're summoned back into Downing Street on the Friday morning, they can't get into their computers because all their passwords have been disabled. I mean, as far as the civil service is concerned, as far as all of us were concerned, Labour was out. And there was this big process to go through Friday trying to keep some semblance of the Labour government in operation.
And Danny, you've right back in London. This is the moment, not just you and Nick Clegg have been preparing for 6 months, but the Liberal Democrats have been preparing for decades. This is the moment when you have the balance of power in your hands. And Clegg makes this quite sort of straightforward position clear. He's already said it before the election, which is, okay, it's up to you, David Cameron, to make the first offer. Why does he do that? And again, what's the mood? I think people underestimate that as you mentioned, there must have been a bit of disappointment that you've lost seats. But in fact, you're in the strongest position the party's been in, certainly in my lifetime.
So there was some disappointment. I think there was also a lot of calm, because at that stage, we were not sure what David Cameron would be willing to offer. And although we hadn't won as many seats as we'd expected, we'd done pretty well in the share of the vote. Nick, as Ed said, Nick had a very good campaign. He'd focused on certain things. And so we really were waiting to see, is the Conservative Party capable of offering something that is sufficient to enable us actually to have a decent conversation with them? We just didn't know if that would be possible or not.
Did you assume there would be a conversation as opposed to David Cameron just saying, look, I'm the person who is the biggest party leader and I should be allowed to form a government, and then at a further down the track persuade you that there was a way to work together? I mean, did you assume that he would be up for more formal talks?
Yeah, I mean, there'd been one or two calls on polling day. I spoke to Ed Llewellyn. I think I was driving to Nethy Bridge to visit the polling station, and my phone went, and there was Ed saying, let's be ready for a call on Friday morning if necessary.
You weren't just an MP, you were the chief of staff weren't you?
I was the chief of staff for Nick. I was the author of the manifesto and the chair of this group. So I was the kind of focal point. And then
it wasn't just that you were ready to talk. You knew that the Cameron team was ready to talk to you.
Well, also, and the Labour team, by the way. So I'd had exchanges of messages with Peter Mandelson, who was at the more enthusiastic end of the spectrum, let's say, on your side of the spectrum.
There was no Labour team, really, though. I mean, there'd been no discussions in the cabinet. I'd not spoken to Gordon Brown once. I turned out to be in the Labour
Mandelson was going behind your back, Ed. We've already discovered something.
I turned out to be in the Labour team.
team.
Honestly, I don't think Labour had any conversations about any
quite
possibility of there being a deal. There was no preparation at all.
That was quite clear when we came to have the conversations with you, which I'm sure we'll come to in a couple of days' time.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. The big call that Cameron makes that morning is to offer the coalition, a big, generous offer of a coalition. And we had considered over a number of previous weeks whether we should try and govern as a minority, whether to have what's called a supply and confidence arrangement, which is when you govern, but you've got some commitment from other parties that they'll back your budget and won't kick you out. But David had asked me a couple of weeks earlier to start thinking about policies that might form the basis of a coalition agreement. And he then spends that Friday morning. We're in the Park Plaza Hotel, by the way, on the other side of Westminster Bridge, which is where we've been staying during the general election rather than in all our different homes. And he had already put calls in to kind of key party figures like Ian Duncan Smith, John Major, Ken Clarke, Liam Fox. These were all characters who were going to be influential in what the Conservative Party thought about this. And then I think he makes the big decision to try to grab the microphone. He goes to what's called St. Stephen's Club. It's a place in Westminster, and he goes on the steps and does this as a public offer to the Liberal Democrats rather than just a private one.
Was it obvious that he could pull that off? I mean, within the Conservative Party, he was supposed to win a majority. He hadn't done so. To be told, no, we're going to do a deal with the Liberal Democrats, wasn't that quite controversial internally?
Well, it's interesting. It didn't become controversial, but we were very nervous that it would. And one of the reasons we were trying to drive the pace was because we thought the longer people start to think, hold on, Cameron hasn't won the election, the Tories haven't won, that things would start to unravel for us and unravel not just for the Conservatives' electoral position, but potentially for the leadership's position inside the Conservative Party. So we were very keen to crack on with it. And there was an offer that came that day from the Cabinet Secretary, Gus O'Donnell, which is you can start formal coalition talks in a government building. He said, this is for Friday, he says you can start tomorrow on Saturday. And he gave us a choice. He says we can have a building in South London somewhere, an anonymous government building. You can do it inside the House of Commons, which has got lots of entrances, so you can not be seen going in and out. Or you can do it in number 70 Whitehall, which is the Cabinet Office right next to 10 Downing Street. And I remember saying, we're going to number 70 Whitehall. We're going right into the heart of government. And by the way, we want the talks to start tonight, Friday, because we were very, very keen, even though we were absolutely shattered. We've been fighting this election for weeks and weeks, absolutely exhausted. But I remember Danny being part of the other negotiating team. I was with William Hague, who was leading the team, Oliver Letwin and Ed Llewellyn, who we've mentioned. And we wanted to get going in order precisely to avoid the whole thing starting to unravel.
No, we had the same feeling because we'd been through all the same options, confidence supply, coalition, and all the intermediate options in between. And we had a kind of tests basically to do with the policies that we could put into practice. But also Nick had been consulting with people like Paddy Ashdown, for example, who he listened to very carefully. And Paddy came into the party HQ, and then Nick and David spoke on the telephone. I think Nick and Gordon Brown also spoke at that point. And informed Gordon that we should talk to the Conservatives first because they'd come first in the election, albeit not won outright. And actually, that feeling that David Cameron had that he hadn't won the election proved to be a bit of a problem for him as time went on much longer, but not in those negotiations.
But the feeling amongst pretty much everybody on the Labour side was that Cameron had not won the election in the way that he wanted, and it wasn't clear whether a deal could be done formally between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, but the Labour had lost the election. And that was pretty much the universal view. And what was happening that day was that Gordon Brown and Andrew Adonis really were trying to persuade lots of people, no, it's still in play, trying to persuade me, trying to persuade Peter Mandelson, trying to persuade Alistair Darling. Lots of people were very sceptical that actually the numbers could add up for Labour just with the Liberal Democrats, that maybe the Lib Dems wouldn't do a deal with the Tories, that we needed to put a policy paper to the Liberal Democrats. As you say, a call was set up between Gordon Brown and Nick Clegg, with Gordon saying we should have talks as well. And he was trying to persuade Nick Clegg. To be honest, he was trying to persuade pretty much the whole Labour cabinet that this was a worthwhile pursuit. And I've got to say, Friday evening, I was pretty unpersuaded.
I mean, I think there's some lessons. We'll draw this all to a conclusion at the end of this. But there are some lessons both for Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. You see, you're describing essentially Sunak's position potentially at the end of this year, which is against expectations. The election result is a hung parliament. Starmer may have more seats, but he hasn't. And you know what you're explaining here, Ed, is that Labour was not united in its position, had not really done much preparation or thinking about how to handle coalition talks, whereas the Conservatives were united behind Cameron, at least at this point on the Friday. And we had done some preparation, but not nearly as much as you guys, Danny, had done, where you'd been thinking properly about this and you had a set of tests and you had already established the key personnel, whereas we were putting together the teams at the last moment.
Gordon and Nick Clegg had barely spoken. I'd be very surprised if Alistair Darling had ever spoken to David Laws about the economy, or to you. Tell me if I'm wrong. We certainly hadn't. There's something I think different about being a government compared to an opposition. In opposition, there's probably more conversation, opposition to opposition about issues. Government to opposition, more formally done with your opposite number. So the Labour links to the Lib Dems, other than sort of historic ones,
I think there were links, but I mean, Vince Cable, for example, was I think did talk to Alistair Darling quite regularly.
But he was totally cut out of the talks by you.
He was not part of the negotiating team. So we had...
As we were told repeatedly.
Exactly.
Don't talk to Vince, you said.
So the point is that Nick was in charge of the party. And so, and it's true, Gordon Brown hadn't made...
Gordon kept trying to talk to Ming Campbell
Gordon
Paddy
hadn't made much
Ashdown,
effort to get to know Nick. Yeah. That's quite true.
That's right.
And it was clear when they were having those conversations, I was in some of those conversations, we'll come to the key one later on, that there was no effort really made to understand the personality involved.
So if you're Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak, you should be getting to know Ed Davey.
You should be getting to know Ed Davey, you should be getting to know all sorts of people.
Right. Great. Okay, so let's keep moving. So we've done Friday night. Let's move on now to Saturday.
Signs of progress tonight as David Cameron and Nick Clegg hold a face-to-face meeting about forming a new government. They returned home a short while ago after 70 minutes of talks said to be amicable and constructive. Earlier, the party leaders had stood together at a service to mark VE Day, but there's no agreement yet on who'll be the new Prime Minister. But the pressure mounts on the Lib Dems to deliver on their big promise to change the voting system.
It is in the interests of everybody in Great Britain for us to use this opportunity to usher in a new politics after the discredited politics.
So it was slightly strange on that Saturday morning to have these post-election VE Day celebrations. So David Cameron, Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister at the time, Nick Clegg, all doing this sort of formal ceremonial stuff. Presumably, were you guys at the same time on that Saturday morning back in negotiation?
Yes, we were. We had had a very short sleep and we were back in this room on the second floor of 70 Whitehall. This is one of the oldest government buildings. And there was a moment when, of course, we'd met previously in the dark the night before. It was daylight now, and one of the Liberal Democrats asked me, I think it was David Laws, what's that garden we're looking at? Because there was a green garden on the other side of the building, which you can see out the window. And I said, that is the 10 Downing Street garden. And that is Gordon Brown's bedroom, I pointed to. And I said, that is how close we are to power, you and I, if we get this right. We are right in their backyard. And we, today, can make real progress in putting that off.
I do remember when we started those talks, Gus O'Donnell was desperate to be in the room, and so were the civil servants. And the first decision we made was, we're going to do this between the two parties. We don't want official support. We want to discuss among ourselves what policies we can agree on. So we shut the door politely.
I thought it was such an important decision. I mean, this is no disrespect to the officials. And Gus O'Donnell all the time was saying, at some point he said, like, Her Majesty the Queen would like to know how you're getting on.
Well, Christopher Geit, do you remember? He was
the Queen's private
secretary at the time. He would be there after the meetings finished, and he wanted a bit of a debrief on how they were going.
But I think not having the civil servants in the room meant that we weren't sort of too bogged down in getting the kind of precise detail of these policies right. Where the civil servants are unbelievably valuable when you are actually a minister. I remember this other moment when Chris Huhne, who was one of the team on the Liberal Democrat side, explains to the Conservative team how the party, the Liberal Democrat Party, is going to have to agree or ratify what's been signed up to in the room. And he says, you've got to understand there's a federal council and we're going to have to get
We had a triple lock. It needed the party executive committee, the parliamentary party, and then we had to have a special conference with the Lib Dems to vote the deal through. So honestly, having a tough internal mechanism definitely increased our bargaining power.
Whereas I remember Chris saying to William Hague, so we know, what's your mechanism? And he said, well, I don't know. If David says it's fine, that's okay. And then he said, you've got to remember with the Conservative Party, Chris, the Conservative Party is a monarchy tempered by regicide. That was our process. It wasn't quite as straightforward as that. We did have to get, as we'll come on to discover, more support from Conservative MPs, but we had enormous latitude. And we were, of course, doing these negotiations whilst at the same time there was a separate track between David Cameron and Nick Clegg, a private conversation. So there were the formal conversations we were having about policy, what the tax policy would be, spending, green environmental policies, education policies like the pupil premium, constitutional policies. But there was a separate, very important conversation going on between Nick and David about the personnel of a potential coalition, how it would actually work in practice. How would you know, who would get what jobs, how many seats in the cabinet would the Liberal Democrats get? Very important things that I think are somewhat neglected in the kind of focus on the policy. I'm not saying policy is not important, but these were also very important discussions that were being had. What's going on in Downing Street at this point?
Well, look, Gordon Brown is boiling with frustration because he's been told by Nick Clegg that he's going to talk to the Conservatives first. And Gordon is embodying the mismatch between the reality of how British politics works and the challenge of coalition formation. Because, you know, if this was Germany or the Netherlands, you might be starting a 2-3 month process of negotiation, whereas on the Saturday morning, the headline in the Sun newspaper was, there is a squatter in Downing Street. A squatter, you know, a man in his late 50s, picture of Gordon Brown. I mean, Gordon Brown was seen to be behaving illegitimately by not leaving Downing Street because the papers wanted to say he'd lost the election. And of course, that was what many people thought. I had quite a fraught conversation with Gordon because he'd spoken to Nick Clegg the night before. I think Danny on the Saturday morning had said it would be okay for there to be an informal conversation between the Liberal Democrats and Labour. I said to Gordon on the phone, you've got to get back to Scotland. You cannot allow the optics of it looking like you are just holed up in Downing Street, clinging on to power. Go back to Scotland and be with your family and let events unfold. And Gordon said to me, well, I will only go back to Scotland if you'll come down and be part of these negotiations with the Liberal Democrats. And I said, well, like, you know, I'm in Yorkshire. And he said, you've got to do it. And if you don't leave now, you won't be in time. So Gordon agreed to fly to Scotland. I raced out to our car, dodged an ITV camera, drove off, stopped and filled the car up with petrol at Trowell motorway services stations at Nottingham, realised I'd left so fast I'd taken no wallet, no money at all. So I had no way.
There was really no money left.
Yeah, there was no, and I had, well, yeah, good grief, Danny. And so
Ed is quite touchy about the letter. We've discovered on this podcast.
Anyway, so I had not taken my wallet. For negotiations, not realising that the Liberal Democrats were about to capitulate to austerity in their talks simultaneously. I had to ring Yvette and say, I can't pay for the petrol I've just filled the car up with. She had to ring the service station and read out the credit card to persuade them to accept this so I could carry on driving into our talks in the afternoon. Of course, the other thing which then happened in this period, I think the thing which actually provoked Gordon to go was this briefing to John Sopel on the BBC Saturday morning from the Liberal Democrats to say that it had been a terrible phone call between Gordon Brown and Nick Clegg, and John Sopel reported how bad this has been and how upset Nick Clegg had been at his treatment by Gordon Brown, who was doing one of his sort of brusque Gordon conversations. And so that it was the first time where politics actually really started to get into the detail of the negotiation. Gordon was quite upset about that.
Just, I think this turns out to be quite an important question during this period, which is there's a sense that Labour disrespect Clegg, that Brown in his conversations is very kind of dismissive or brusque, that we've touched on it already. A lot of the Labour figures are reaching out to other Liberal Democrats, not Clegg. They're reaching out to Vince Cable or Ming Gamble or Paddy Ashdown. But of course, none of those people are the party leader. I think there's a very important lesson, by the way, again, for Sunak and Starmer this year, which is you've got to treat the people you want to be in government with you with respect right from the beginning. Do you think, looking back on it, Ed, that's fair, that there was a mistake, that the tone was wrong? And it'd be interesting to hear what you think, Danny, because you were on the receiving end of all this.
I don't think there was deep political links with Nick Clegg in the way there was for Gordon with Vince Cable or Ming Campbell. He was not seen as being on the Labour side of the Liberal Democrats. He wasn't seen as being hugely predisposed to working with Labour. I don't think any of us ever believed that Nick Clegg wanted to do a deal with Labour. And the constitutional principle that he had invented, which is that I'll speak to the party with the biggest vote and the largest number of seats, we all assumed was a way of him avoiding talking to Labour and avoiding talking to the Conservatives. If you look kind of in retrospect at what people would look back on that period and say was that, if it hadn't been for Europe, Nick Clegg might have been a Conservative. He wasn't really Labour inclined, and therefore, and I think that undoubtedly shaped part of Gordon's view. I think that is right, and I think it was probably a mistake. Although, let's be honest, as we'll see in the days which unfold, the sort of a lot of politics was played on this relationships front.
But you're shaking your head, Danny. At that point.
I think there's something else going on here, which is more political and not personal, which is that we'd certainly formed the view that if we were going to talk to the Labour Party, it had to be on the basis that Gordon Brown, who'd been the Prime Minister who'd lost the election, would not be the Prime Minister anymore. And so...
why did you come to that conclusion?
Because we'd been through this election campaign where he was the leader. He was the one who'd embodied everything that Labour was offering. And he'd been defeated. And though David Cameron hadn't won, Gordon Brown had definitely lost. And so we thought that the optics of putting Gordon Brown back into number 10 was just politically impossible.
I think that's fair enough, but that is not what Nick Clegg had said to Gordon on the phone on the Friday. That is not what was discussed in our discussion on the Saturday. If you remember, when we had those talks in Portcullis House on Saturday afternoon, they were quite short, they were quite amicable. At one point, Chris Huhne said, we have to raise the issue of Gordon Brown and whether he can carry on. And you shut him down and said, no, Chris, that is not for discussion here. That's not for this meeting. And so we, of course, knew that was probably the view of some Lib Dems, but it wasn't being talked about. That didn't really rise in the conversations until the Sunday.
But it wasn't one for that meeting. That's because there was another meeting planned on the Sunday for Nick and Gordon to talk about that very question.
Fair enough. So we all thought we were in a non-meeting and we were right.
So what we were trying to do in that meeting was to see whether you guys were united and serious. And you definitely weren't united, and there were different levels of seriousness around on your side.
Perhaps. I think it was actually kind of quite a
and also,
meeting.
I remember you made a comment in that meeting which was about the numbers, and of course in politics numbers don't lie, and could you keep all your people united? And I think John Reid had just been out on the airwaves that day saying there's no way we should be staying on in government or something to that effect.
If we appear to be not accepting the decision of the electorate, we lost nearly 100 seats, the biggest loss in our history, apart from 1931. And I think if we now decide that we're just going to cock a snoop at the electorate or look that way, that the electorate will wreak vengeance on us and we will suffer most grievously in the future.
So it was already becoming clear that there was a small and maybe growing group of Labour MPs who didn't want to be part of this. And Peter Mandelson was there saying, well, you don't worry, I can get the Democratic Unionists on side, which, we saw later on.
Shades of Theresa May in 2017.
If you were picking up that there was scepticism in the room on the Saturday amongst a number of us that this could actually be delivered, you were right. But it wasn't hostile.
No, it wasn't hostile.
There was no argument. It was quite pleasant. It was just all quite difficult.
It wasn't hostile. No, I agree with that. But it was... In a sense, again, this is not really about feelings. This is about facts, and what we discerned as a fact from your group was that a lot of you didn't think it could work. Not out of ill will or bad feeling, but just you didn't think it could work.
Look, we were quite surprised to be in the negotiating team. Weren't totally sure what the negotiation was about. Weren't sure what our end game was supposed to be. I mean, it was, we were all doing our best, but we weren't quite sure what the hell was going on, to be honest.
So let's move on now to the Sunday, because on the Saturday we leave it that it doesn't look like any side conversation with Labour is getting anywhere. We're making good progress on the main talks between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. But by the end of Sunday, as this clip will remind us, in fact, things have started to break down between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And we in the Conservatives was sort of rather surprised to find it looked like we might have been ditched.
Top stories at 6. We'll meet again. Power sharing talks between the Tories and Lib Dems have ended for the day, but the two sides say negotiations will continue. Nick Clegg has been talking, holding a phone conversation with David Cameron this afternoon as the Tory leader heads to his parliamentary office for an open session with MPs. But Gordon Brown is battling on, meeting his inner circle at Downing Street. We'll have all the latest live on this fast-moving story from across Westminster.
So here's an example of where I think the news is behind real events, because by Sunday night, we had started to give up on the concept of a coalition. We were talking potentially about a supply and confidence motion. We were very nervous about Liberal Democrat talks with Labour. And there was a big sticking point. There was a big issue. We had managed to persuade the Liberal Democrats to sign up to our economic policy on public expenditure reductions. And in fact, Mervyn King had been played in, Gus O'Donnell had been played in, and Nick Macpherson, the Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, had all spoken to Vince Cable, and I think there had been calls with Nick Clegg to persuade him that things needed to happen to constrain public spending. This is later became known as austerity, because remember, overhanging all of this is a pervading sense of economic crisis, with other countries like Greece getting into trouble precisely at this weekend. But there's a big constitutional sticking point, which is, could anyone offer the Liberal Democrats, either the Conservatives or the Labour, a change in the voting system? And we were beginning to run into this brick wall, which was the Liberal Democrats wanted things we didn't think we could give on the voting system. And it appeared to us by the end of Sunday that Labour, or rather Gordon Brown specifically, was prepared to cut a deal on the voting system. Danny, is that a fair reflection of where we got on Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, to say there was definitely a sense of urgency because of the economic situation. That was from the very beginning, and I think that was true on all sides, actually. And then for the Liberal Democrats, electoral reform and political reform more generally was absolutely a central issue, had been for decades. And we could not form a coalition government unless we had some ability to move the issue of electoral reform forward. And we were very transparent about that. And we had in our team, in addition to myself and David Laws, Chris Huhne and Andrew Stunnell, they were both played in to be sometimes the bad cop in the discussions. And we were very clear, we're just not taking this any further unless you can bring something forward on electoral reform.
There are 2 Gordon Brown, Nick Clegg meetings over the course of this afternoon. And but I have to say, our feeling that day, certainly my feeling that day, was it was a bit like being a football chairman in the Premier League when you've got a star striker who you're trying to sign and they're talking to you and the agent's talking to you and you're having some negotiations, but you really know the striker wants to sign for the other club and he and the agent are just trying to find a way in which they can kind of bid up the money. And so you do feel a little bit kind of used in this. I don't think at the time we ever thought that these were really serious negotiations we were having with the Lib Dems, not least because Nick Clegg was desperate for it not to be known he was going to have these meetings with Gordon Brown on the Sunday. He wanted it to be all focused on the discussions with the Tories. There was a first meeting in the afternoon at which I think Nick is asking for legislation on the AV referendum to be in place before the referendums actually happened.
We should explain AV, the alternative vote.
A soft version of proportional representation, which was kind of the discussion which Labour had initiated during the election campaign, and that, I mean, it wasn't probably what the Lib Dems wanted. It was in play. And there's a first discussion between Gordon and Nick, and Gordon's wanting to kind of give what he can on that. We then had a discussion in the evening, again in Portcullis House. I'd actually spent the afternoon bizarrely sitting in my department, in the education department. I was back in there totally alone because there was nowhere else to go while I waited for this meeting, thinking, why the hell am I back in the education department? You know, I thought I'd stopped being a cabinet minister a couple of days ago. But then we have our discussions. I have to say, we are quite open to the discussion about political reform. I think you wanted us to ditch ID cards. We were all happy to do that. We were taken aback that you were supporting in-year public spending cuts, because that was not the Alistair Darling position and that was not the Vince Cable position. You'd fought the election opposing in-year spending cuts in 2010 and then had changed your position. You'd gone towards the Osborne view on austerity, and that was kind of a bit of a tension. But then, of course, a second meeting occurs then deep in the bowels of Westminster late at night with Gordon and Nick, at which you attend with Peter Mandelson. And that is the moment when actually things really start to get heavy, because we break away, as I understand it, from the sort of Nick Gordon phoniness. And Danny Alexander says, Gordon Brown's got to go if there's to be any progress.
So come on, tell us about, you looked Gordon Brown in the eyes and you told him he had to go. Is that true?
This was one of the more interesting meetings of my political life. So the purpose of the meeting was precisely for Nick to give that message to Gordon, right? Which is to say that we're happy to continue conversations to work with Labour, but it has to be on the basis that if a coalition government is formed, you will step aside as Prime Minister. We didn't want to dictate who the new Prime Minister should be. That's not for us, but Labour should have a process to appoint a successor.
But Nick didn't quite deliver it with the toughness that you wanted?
And it was clear from Gordon's responses that Nick was delivering the message too politely. He's a very polite person. And it wasn't getting through.
Gordon was saying, I'll stand down in the autumn once the AV referendum's through. And you were thinking, tomorrow is not early
Gordon
enough.
was saying, think what we could do together over the next year, and then I can make way for somebody else. And I just said, look, Gordon, what Nick is saying is that in order for these talks to go on, it has to be on the basis that you are no longer Prime Minister.
But come on, Dan, let me press you on this. So you're a young man, relatively new as an MP. You've got... so was I. I was only 38 at the time. But Gordon Brown has absolutely dominated politics.
A great man.
Many years. Been this big figure, Chancellor and Prime Minister. What was it like telling him he had to quit?
It was a tough thing to say because whatever you thought of him as a Prime Minister and a leader, he had done a great job as an international leader to get the world through the financial crisis. So I had a lot of respect for him. But it was a political fact. And if that fact was not communicated, then these conversations couldn't go on. So that was my job. And it had to be done. And it had to be done clearly and so that it was unambiguous. And I knew from the way Peter Mandelson arched his eyebrows after I said it that the message had got through. So that was fine. That was enough. But it was a very difficult meeting. And after a few seconds silence after I spoke, the conversation went on as before. But clearly the message had got through. It's a very painful thing to say. But again, politics is about being clear.
So there's good and bad news if you're looking at 2024 for the Conservatives, which is you might still be in the coalition negotiations, but the Liberal Democrats might ask that Rishi Sunak stands down. Let's move on to the Monday. This is when, on the Conservative side, we feel the talks have broken down, but it turns out to be a pretty dramatic day again in British politics.
Because if there was any doubt that the message had got through, Gordon Brown was determined to make it absolutely clear. Hence the statement he makes at 5 o'clock, I think, on Monday afternoon.
Gordon Brown has announced he intends to step down as Labour leader, but will continue temporarily as Prime Minister as he tries to form a new government. Speaking in Downing Street, Mr Brown said the Liberal Democrats had asked to open formal negotiations with Labour. When the issue of who forms the government is settled, Mr Brown will go.
But I have no desire to stay in my position longer than is needed to ensure the path to economic growth is assured and the process of political reform we have agreed moves forward quickly.
Mr Brown's statement came after a day which ended with the Liberal Democrats saying there was still no deal with the Conservatives.
And this discussion is dependent not only on the Liberal Democrat Party, but also on the proposals and discussions that are ongoing with the Conservative Party and the representations that, frankly, are being made by the Labour Party.
And right now in the House of Commons, Conservative MPs are meeting David Cameron. Where does this leave his bid for government? We'll have the latest from Westminster, where the Cabinet is meeting and Britain's political future hangs in the balance.
So Andrew Adonis reports in his book that he had a voicemail at 2 a.m. on Monday from Paddy Ashdown saying, we've got to speak. And when he finally speaks to him early in the morning, it turns out that the word is Gordon Brown has refused to give Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander what they wanted the night before. He's refused to go, and this is terrible, and he is the obstacle, and it's being sabotaged. And Gordon, I met with him and Peter Mandelson that morning, and he said, look, that's fine, because I'll just announce I'm going to stand aside. And Gordon, I think, thought that maybe this would unblock things. And I think we thought, well, this will definitely call their bluff. Because if Gordon says, I'm going, and my successor can then essentially take this forward after a couple of months, well then, the Lib Dems aren't going to be able to blame Gordon Brown for being the obstacle. We'll find out whether they are really serious about doing this deal, and that's what he announces.
Well, Gary, you'd worked with Gordon Brown all these years. Very proud man. What was it like for him to have to announce he was resigning? Emotionally up close to him, how did it feel in the room?
Look, Gordon is a politician and a statesman, and he knows when things have gone in a particular direction, and he's good at making decisions in these kind of moments. And so Monday morning, he was absolutely clear. If I'm the obstacle, then I'll stand aside, because in his mind, what he was talking about, the economic plan, a Labour, Liberal Democrat, progressive coalition, was much more important than him. So, there was no persuading him. Nobody tried to persuade him. It was actually kind of quite matter of fact. This is what I'm going to do. And I think the thing which he wanted was for Nick Clegg to agree that as a quid pro quo, there would be parallel talks with Labour and Lib Dems about the possibility of a Labour deal. And that was something that Nick was hinting he might agree to, and David Laws then publicly suggested wasn't going to happen. But I think he just wanted to get on with it.
But this was a very big and important moment, because it did unblock things, and actually it unblocked things on both sides.
Well, which is put massive pressure on the Conservatives.
Right.
At that point, they've suddenly got to come up with a deal on PR.
So that's right. And so that was, of course, partly in our minds, is that a coalition's only going to work if we make progress on these policies. Nick didn't have a strong view about whether he didn't prefer to be with the Conservatives or Labour. He preferred to be in a government that would deliver what he wanted. The big issue...
I'm looking quizzically at Downey.
No, you are, and you're entitled to. But
very quizzically.
But the big issue was the numbers, right? To do a deal with Labour would have been very politically complex. Every single vote in Parliament would have been complex. With the Conservatives, a substantial majority between the two parties, and so
I think you're definitely right on the numbers.
But
just to throw this back to you, just in terms of the Lib Dems, at this moment, suddenly, I think as I read it for Nick or for David Laws, maybe for you, going with the Tories kind of fitted more easily from an economic policy point of view, a bit more Orange Book liberal. Small state liberalism, the kind of thing that David Laws and others had championed. But there's people on the other side of the party, like Charles Kennedy, like Paddy Ashdown, slightly more Labour-leaning, Vince Cable. They had been told, I know, but Gordon Brown is the obstacle. Once he's removed, does it suddenly mean you've got senior Lib Dems saying to Nick, well, actually, maybe a deal with Labour is now possible? And does that make it harder?
In our party, we had these accountability mechanisms. We were discussing with our parliamentary party every evening almost what was going on. And one of the questions was, is Labour serious or not? And so we had to try our best to explore both options. And there was pressure on both sides. And in a sense, we had to see what could be done with Labour. Was there really a willingness on their part? And could you make the numbers add up? And could we get something with the Conservatives that would actually move forward the issues that Liberal Democrats have been campaigning on for decades? And so I think it was good negotiation, honestly, on our part to bring both sides to the table.
So I've got two questions, which is, do you think you could have extracted more? Because Monday is the day when a lot of the key parts of the coalition agreement fall into place that then governs the country for the next 5 years. So the Liberal Democrats sign up to our public expenditure plans. We sign up to your income tax proposals on taking the low paid out of income tax. There's a set of green initiatives, education initiatives. There's actually a row about Trident, which gets a bit lost in the whole recollection of the period, but was quite important. I wondered in 2015, so jumping ahead, where we thought we might be in another hung parliament and we might be in a further coalition. I thought if I was the Liberal Democrats, seeing what had happened over the last 5 years, I might ask for more. For example, I might demand that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is a Liberal Democrat in this coalition. Do you think, looking back on that period, you could have extracted more?
I think on the policy side, we extracted a good deal. I mean, I think we said at the end of it, the main things we said in our manifesto were all being delivered. But about 70% of our manifesto pledges were in the coalition agreement, and they were all delivered. So that's not bad. But as you said, the discussions about personnel and departments and so on, those were on a different track. Those weren't in the discussions that we were taking part in. And I think, we'd looked at different structures of coalitions in other countries. I mean, Ed made the point, many European countries have coalitions. And in some of those, the minority party, takes full ownership of 2 or 3 ministries, and all the ministers are the minority party.
We had discussed Nick Clegg becoming Home Secretary.
Right.
That was actually an option, which was give him a big department.
And we had
rather than just Foreign Secretary.
Well, because we thought that was too out of
so we had these discussions internally as well, right? Should Nick become Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary, or
he definitely should have done,
or should he become head of a ministry that was really really a key Lib Dem policy, like the Education Ministry? We had this pupil premium. We were focused on delivering better education for kids from low income backgrounds, so that he could really be identified with a policy. And in the end, we decided that it was better for him to be in a position where he had a chance to have oversight over the whole government and try and push the implementation of all of the policies. That may have been a mistake,
well,
right? It may have been better
he was
to
Minister
say
for Constitutional Reform.
He
was kind of how it was billed. But the problem was, if you think of constitutional reform and the Lib Dem manifesto, the AV referendum didn't work out. On Europe, you ended up with a referendum to leave the European Union, and in addition to that, you ended up signing up to raising tuition fees.
Sorry,
so you'd have
right.
to say it didn't kind of quite deliver the way you expected.
We didn't have a referendum on leaving the European Union. That happened after we left the government. That was a Conservative policy after the election.
Okay.
So that was nothing to do with the Lib Dems.
Well,
we're not. Hold on, wait. We're going back to. We're jumping ahead here.
Absolutely not. It's nonsense. It's just an ad hominem attack.
An ad hominem attack. It was announced by the Prime Minister of a government of which you remember.
It was a Conservative Party policy, not a coalition government policy.
Right.
Okay.
No wonder they didn't form a coalition. So look,
this is
let's go back to the Monday. There's a key moment. I do, by the way. Well, we can talk about it some other time. I do think one of Labour's problems is it's very tribal. It's one of the things that puts people off Labour. Anyway, we're not going to open up that route. It's
George, I'm not tribal. Osborne reaches out.
Monday is a key day because Gordon Brown's announced he's stepping down, but crucially, David Cameron gets the support of the shadow cabinet and the 1922 committee. This is the gathering of all the Tory MPs. I remember it all took place in the committee room 14, I think it is, in the House of Commons. And there's a brand new parliamentary party. All these people have been elected. Like suddenly we had almost 100 new MPs. We hadn't met them like this in Parliament. And in a classic kind of Tory way, it was actually a bit like a union block vote. Instead of any kind of proper Liberal Democrat constitutional procedure, it was just like, are we in favour of offering an AV referendum as part of a price of coalition? Hands up if you're in favour. It was like, everyone put their hand up. And so we went into Monday night essentially with the main planks of an agreement in place.
Right. And simultaneously, there's a cabinet meeting of the government where there is a tacit agreement to continue with the negotiations, but actually with a sort of a lot of caution around the table. I think Andy Burnham spoke out against it overtly. Jack Straw, Alistair Darling, very cautious. And a sense that the AV announcement from the Conservatives had actually shifted things decisively in the direction I think we all thought it was going to go, which was a Conservative Liberal Democrat deal. And then we went into another round of negotiations that evening, which were fractious, because I think the impression we had on the Monday night was that nobody on the Lib Dem side was really interested in talking to Labour, that it was quite perfunctory, it was quite short, it was quite aggressive, and the real discussions were happening somewhere else.
So let's turn to Tuesday, the 11th of May. This is the end of the story. And I won't give away the punchline when I tell you that David Cameron becomes the Prime Minister at the end of this day.
A big step closer to a new government for Britain. The Liberal Democrats are back in talks with the Conservatives. The Labour team that tried to do an alternative deal that would keep them in power. Hours of talks, but no agreement. Clegg, the kingmaker. It's his call, and all day he's under pressure to make up his mind.
I'm as impatient as anybody else to get on with this, to resolve matters one way or another.
The Tory team calls for an end to the uncertainty about who governs Britain. They want David Cameron in number 10, and soon.
It is now, I believe, decision time for the Liberal Democrats, and I hope they make the right decisions that will give this country the strong, stable government that it badly needs.
What happens today is actually Gordon Brown calls the bluff on the Tory and Liberal Democrat negotiating teams by announcing that he is going to the palace and he is quitting as Prime Minister. This happens a bit later on in the day. I remember watching it on television with David Laws. We had to interrupt our talks and say, look, I know we've been going around the houses on the Trident policy or the environmental policy, but events are now unfolding. We don't have a coalition agreement yet signed, and Gordon Brown is leaving as Prime Minister. By the way, this puts pressure on the Liberal Democrats because it opens up for the very first time in all of this period an option for Cameron, which is to become the minority Prime Minister, which he couldn't have done simply by asserting he wanted to be the minority Prime Minister. He needed Gordon Brown to leave.
Well, I remember that day we were going on with the talks. Gordon Brown didn't resign till late afternoon, and so we were constantly late afternoon,
about 7 o'clock.
And so there were these calls going on with him. Nick had a couple of calls with him, where he was obviously testing to see was Nick serious or not. And we'd sort of formed the view, honestly, that Labour wasn't united enough to be able to form a deal with. Rightly or wrongly, that was the view that we'd formed. At the same time, my wife was 9 months pregnant. Right. My cell phone went in the talks that morning, and I said, "I'm sorry, I have to step outside. I may not be coming back." And all the Tories looked like they didn't know what was going on. And it was my wife just calling to say, "Everything's fine. I'm travelling to London today." And so, yes, there was pressure on us because there were certain things we had to get through in the talks that day, and we knew that at some point Gordon would decide to up sticks and go to the palace. But I think we also thought that once we'd discussed the AV thing in detail, we'd discussed the details around it. Having made the commitment, the Conservative side was not that fussed about some of the details. Was our sense. They just wanted to get on with it. And so
there's the pragmatic Tories for you. Just get on with it.
But then we had to go back later to our parliamentary parties and get their decision. And this was not all the new backbenchers stand up and raise their hands. This was a discussion and a debate.
And that happened after
it happened,
Cameron had arrived in Downing Street.
Yeah, and I remember the decisive intervention was Paddy Ashdown's, and he made a long speech about the inner turmoil he was going through, which I think everyone felt in some way. And then he concluded by saying, "Fuck it, let's do it."
I mean, good.
And that was the decisive moment.
I think the reality was that the Lib Dems' attempt to use potentially a deal with Labour as a way of putting pressure on the Conservatives to concede more essentially ran out of road at about midday on the Tuesday. There'd been a briefing to Paddy Ashdown from within the talks overnight, Monday into Tuesday, that me and Ed Miliband had been obstructive in the conversations. And we were both a bit mystified because, I think we were sceptical, but we weren't obstructive. If there was a deal to be done, fine. We just never believed that you were serious. And
we didn't think you were serious.
No. Well, I mean, we were being accused of being squatters in Downing Street from Friday morning. Cabinet ministers didn't want to go to their offices or use government cars because we didn't want to look as though we were being illegitimate. The trouble is, in our system, if you haven't got a government and you haven't got a prime minister, things are very bad. And what happened over the course of that Tuesday was Nick Clegg kept urging Gordon to stay on as prime minister while he continued his negotiations with the Conservatives. Actually, the feedback we were getting from Gus O'Donnell was that the palace was desperate for Gordon not to resign as Prime Minister because they didn't want to put the Queen in the constitutionally awkward position of not knowing who consensually was to be the Prime Minister. And so couldn't he stay on? And the tension between the politics of being the squatter and the constitutional propriety of staying on as Prime Minister just became overwhelming in those hours. And in the end, Gordon just said to Nick, "I'm sorry, Nick, I can't do this anymore. I'm going." He didn't want to leave Downing Street in the dark. Basically walked out and said to the Cabinet Secretary, the Palace, and Nick, "Sorry, I'm just leaving." But I mean, our system doesn't really have a way to manage these hours.
You're right. And you could feel that tension. And you're right. Constitutionally, we have to have a Prime Minister. And so what Nick was saying, in effect, was, please do your duty until there is someone the Palace can legitimately call upon.
Or until I'm ready.
Yeah. And until the talks have concluded and there actually can be a government.
And that's what I mean by, in the end, the Labour leverage for the Lib Dems against the Conservatives essentially ran out of road in those hours.
But basically, by then, the deal was done. I mean, what we were doing in the talks that afternoon was important stuff, but the key issues had been solved. We were working through some other things. There was a difficult conversation about Trident. and a couple of other difficult issues as well. But actually, we were, I think by the time Gordon Brown got in his car, we were pretty much done.
And what's amazing is what was negotiated during those 5 days held for 5 years. And that is staggering, given the country had no memory of coalition. There was no kind of constitutional procedure for negotiating one. None of the people involved have ever done it. And there were a lot of predictions that it would fail. And it's kind of amazing that in those 5 days, I sometimes worry, I remember worrying in 2015, if we'd had to have new coalition talks, that it was going to take months, that there was something about the urgency and the novelty of it that enabled us to just get on with it and get it done.
One of the interesting things was that for the civil servants, the coalition agreement having been negotiated, it was almost like a contract for the government. It seemed almost to have a higher status than a manifesto for a single-party government. Because we'd been through it together, this agreement was what enabled this government to take place. And so it wasn't, can you do this or can't you do it, or in a different way. It was, okay, we have this list of 140 things. They have to be delivered.
Can I ask one final question of you, Danny? Which is, what would your advice be to Liberal Democrats in 2024 if they find themselves in a similar position that you and Nick did? Has Ed Davey made a big mistake before these talks, if they were to ever happen, have happened, by saying he would never do a deal with the Conservatives? Because, Ed, you might be right that maybe there could never have been a coalition with Labour. Maybe the election result was overwhelmingly a rejection of Labour and the Tories were coming in. But it did extract, the threat of a Labour coalition,
of course,
did extract the AV referendum pledge from the Conservatives, which was duly held a year later or whatever it was.
So we knew we were being used for that.
But do you think
and
Davies
the briefings against us were part of the politics of trying to shift all of that?
We've been talking about things Sunak and Starmer might learn from all of this. Ed Davey, by the way, was a cabinet minister in this coalition, so he saw coalition close up. What are the kind of key couple of lessons you learned?
Well, I think Ed Davey has already been clear about what his views are. I think the thing that we missed in these discussions was actually not about the politics. It was about the mechanics and how the government worked. I think that's where we really we had a whole plan for that, and that's what we ran out of time for. And that's what caught us out on a lot of issues later on. If you're ever in this, I don't think they will be in this position, right? I don't think they want to be in this position. But if they are, you've got to take care of not just...
What do you mean they don't want to be in this position?
Well, I think...
one coalition was enough.
No, I think a lot, having been in there for 5 years and been through a period where we delivered a lot of what we cared about, and I think most of us are very proud of that. Nonetheless, the electoral consequences for the Liberal Democrats were savage. And so the political willingness to get into that position again is, I think, pretty limited.
There's some truth, isn't there, that Nick was, had been a member of the European Parliament. He'd kind of grown up in Brussels. He had a very European view of politics. And for him, it was quite comfortable, the idea that you would have a long, thoughtful negotiation after an election where you would work out what coalition could be formed and what the agreement should be. And the problem we had was that our system finds that very, very difficult to deal with. We're used to there being a winner and a loser, and Labour had lost, and we wanted to lose in a graceful way, and we didn't want to look like we were clinging on. And at the moment, our system doesn't make it easy to have the kind of negotiation that you wanted to have. Is it possible to change it?
I actually think we had the type of negotiation that we expected to have. And as George said, I think rightly, that what we came up with was actually a very good agreement in policy terms. In our system, two parties being in government doesn't sit comfortably. And so if you're the third party, you have to think very differently about how you communicate and about how government works. And if you can't change how government works, then your ability to win the government as much as you win or lose the election is really impaired. And I think that's what we suffered from. But
you could have an American type system where you say that you're going to have a period of weeks after the election before the new government starts, during which there is a handover and you make space for this kind of negotiation if you need it.
Maybe that's why Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg became President Nick Clegg, which is his current job. On that, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Danny
Alexander.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
So I've been having a slightly out-of-body experience talking about all this. I can't quite believe that was the same person as I am today in the middle of those sort of momentous events in our nation's political life. And I've also used the opportunity to sort of look back at some of the photos taken behind the scenes, which maybe we'll be able to put up on social media, of like talks in the kind of key negotiating room and so on. And I have to remind myself, yes, that was me. And so I find the whole thing sort of quite distant, to be honest.
Can you remember how you felt in those hours when David Cameron was, suddenly about to go to the palace?
Do you know, the overwhelming feeling I had, and this is going to sound very odd to people, I think, was not of excitement. It wasn't even of kind of anxiety about taking on this big job. It was an enormous sense of relief. I know David actually felt something similar when he became Prime Minister, that we had got there and that somehow it justified not only how we had chosen to spend our careers, the decisions we'd made in life to go into politics, and that we had at least succeeded in getting to a high office and getting the party into government, but also relief that we had carried our party to this point. There was a huge weight of expectation, particularly on David's shoulders, but also on mine.
And you were so young.
I was only 38 at the time. And I just remember thinking, what a relief. And I remember someone once said to me, there are 3 great moments in a political career. The first is when they go, I, the returning officer for Tatton, declared you elected Member of Parliament. You and I have that experience. It's fantastic. The second is when they say, someone says to you, Ed, George, I'd like you to join the cabinet. And you go, I've made it to the cabinet. And then the third, which neither of us ever heard, was,
no.
Mr. Osborne, are you ready to form a government? When the King or the Queen says that to you. We never got to that point.
We were ready for it.
We were ready. No, we wouldn't have said no if someone had asked us. But so, yeah, I felt enormous relief. And that night which we'll talk about some future point of coming into Downing Street, I just thought, we made it. And then it was next morning when it was like, oh my God, now I'm the Chancellor and there's a huge responsibility on my shoulders.
See, for us, it was the opposite, of course, because we had been in Downing Street for 13 years and this was the end. And we really knew from about 2 in the afternoon that it was ending that day. And there was a sort of gathering in Gordon's big office, and there was a wider range of people. I mean, Peter Mandelson, Alistair Campbell, Andrew Adonis were there, as well as Gordon's core team, Sarah Brown. And we were all sitting around waiting for these Nick Clegg calls. And so there was a lot of reminiscing. We did what we always did with Gordon. We would tell his jokes and then make him deliver the punchline, and everybody would pretend to laugh. There was humour, but it was also like a very momentous ending. And a sense that this might be the last time any of us would ever be serving in Downing Street. And then Gordon had Sarah and his kids there, and he had kept them so out of the public eye, and had decided that they wanted the children to walk with him out of Downing Street so that there would be photos so they could remember that's where they'd lived and that their dad had been Prime Minister. And I stood and watched this. And when we'd come into government in 1997, we had no children. And now they were 11, 9, and 6. They'd all grown up with their mum and dad in Downing Street, in politics, in government. And that was ending, and we didn't know what was going to come next. But it was the opposite emotion. It was, I guess, relief that those days had finished, but a sense of loss, of mourning, of things coming to an end. It was quite a somber time.
I had very similar feelings, but that was all 6 years later when something similar happened to me. I do remember watching on television, absolutely gripped. I've always, as well as being a participant in politics, I've always been a spectator in the sense that I've really enjoyed watching political events. I remember when I was in fact a very junior employee in Downing Street, watching Tony Blair arriving in Downing Street from home and being excited about it, even though I'd lost my job that day. And I remember watching Gordon Brown walking out with his children and being quite emotional. Exactly. And by the way, Gordon Brown and I, don't have now and didn't have then a very good relationship. So there was no particular personal connection, but I could see the kind of human element. And it was almost like a sort of revelation he had these children. I mean, he was such a sort of political machine. It was unlike Blair, who had, the family was very much part of the Blair image. I think for Gordon was such a sort of political, colossus, and you didn't really sort of think he had a hinterland, and that was the moment it was revealed. I have to say, I had a sort of
But of course, his first daughter had died when he was the Chancellor. And then he had 2 sons, one of whom had cystic fibrosis, which had been kind of revealed by the Sun newspaper, a leak from the hospital. And he and Sarah had made a decision, and we'd done the same, Yvette and I. In fact, we'd done this before they did. We talked to them about it, which was that in the end, to keep your children out of the public eye would in the end be something they would be very grateful for. And Gordon and Sarah decided not to let their children be part of that
until
image.
the end.
Until the end, because that was the departing moment. And I think that they paid a big price for that. I think it's really hard. If you are cabinet minister, even the chancellor, fine. But if you are the prime minister, if you are the king, to keep your family out of the public eye, people expect to see them. But at the same time, we all chose to be politicians and they didn't.
Yeah, but I have to say I had a very, I was at the time absolutely ruthlessly focused on getting the Conservatives and myself into office. And I remember thinking as Gordon walked down the street with the children, if he'd shown us a bit more of that, he would have been a harder person to beat.
That is maybe right.
But no, and I thought it was actually very nice for me to be with Danny Alexander because he is a good friend. He was at my wedding earlier this year. We ended up working very closely together in the Treasury. That wasn't at the expectation, in fact, then, because it was expected that David Laws would go into the Treasury and Danny Alexander would become the Scottish Secretary. But we ended up being very, very close friends. But I couldn't help notice, you got quite tetchy with him at one point in the conversation we had. There was a bit of irritation bubbling up there, wasn't there?
There was. And it took me a bit by surprise being transported back to those days. But at the same time, that's very real and very raw. And it's important to kind of explain this, really. We sit across from each other talking about politics. And at the time, you were coming in to be Chancellor. You were a Conservative. You wanted to cut the size of the state. You were happy to cut public spending. You were never that bothered about tax credits. You were quite happy to use a political argument if you could to put Labour on the defensive. I never complained about that. I just thought that was politics. That was the world we were in. And we were sort of, if you won and we lost, then that was our fault. And so I never feel any sort of antagonism to that. I'm not one of these people who has to hate my opponents. In fact, I hate that style of politics which has become so prevalent in recent years. And I think that's why we can talk and reflect and learn, and we don't have to agree on everything. But it's different with the Liberal Democrats because
there's quite a lot of Tories who agree with you on that. But I'm not one of them, but I know. But explain why.
Well, it's different because the thing was they were the guys who always were claiming to be progressive or a bit left of centre. They were the ones who wanted to be more kind of committed to and less pragmatic than Labour. They had fought the general election opposing immediate cuts in public spending. They had at various times attacked Labour from the left when we were in government. And then suddenly, in that moment, they do this huge flip. Vince Cable's excluded. They're immediately backing in-year public spending cuts. They sort of become champions of this strategy, your strategy, and that changes things because it's not a Conservative government's plan. It suddenly becomes the national coalition in the national interest. And Nick Clegg had a choice. David Laws and Danny did, which is they could have said, we're going into this coalition to try and moderate the Conservatives, to hold them to account. And in some areas they did that. But on the central issue of the economy and public spending, they went in and suddenly gung-ho became, it was Labour's fault. It was Labour's public spending irresponsibility. Reducing the deficit is the driving force of this coalition. They signed up to the whole economic strategy which you'd set out, look, hook, line and sinker. And we just thought, what are you doing? And that is the thing I still find very hard. So those moments with Danny Alexander where I was sort of saying, look, be honest about what you actually did. Those were the points where it got tetchy.
So I would make a couple of observations. First of all, I think they honestly believe that there needed to be reductions in the deficit. And I would say if you cast yourself back to that...
Yeah, but so did we.
Yes, but remember, that was not hardly front and centre of what Gordon Brown was telling the country. It was what actually the late Alistair Darling was saying. And
it's what I said very many times. I think Gordon did say it too.
I know, but come on, it wasn't a kind of central part of the campaign that Labour was fighting that, tough cuts are coming in public spending. So I think we touched on it in the conversation with Danny Alexander, but Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, the permanent secretary at the Treasury, the cabinet secretary, we're all impressing on the Liberal Democrats how important it was to have credible spending plans. And they bought it, including Vince Cable. Second point was...
But they all thought Alistair Darling's spending plans were credible before. And so the idea that suddenly credible plans meant a change from the Darling plans...
Well, I think this was, if I was...
There was a bit of politics being played there, particularly by the government,
I
let's
think
be honest.
we achieved a very good outcome in the negotiation with the Liberal Democrats
You
because
certainly
we
did.
gave them things that we were very happy to concede. So their big ask on the
Which then
economy...
exploded in their faces.
Well, their big ask on the economy was cutting income tax by increasing thresholds. I was like, fine. If you want to cut income tax, I'm all for cutting income tax.
Which Rishi Sunak is now entirely unwound.
He is almost entirely unwound. Second, they wanted a pupil premium, i.e. extra money for poorer children in schools. That was actually an idea the Conservatives had also been talking about. They wanted some additional commitments on the environment. That was fine. Cameron at the time was talking about, vote blue, go green. That was fine. And the big concession, which was hard because... it was hard with our party, was the AV referendum on the voting system. But the price for all of those was sign up to George Osborne's economic plans. And they did. And I thought coming out of it, we have secured what we really need, which is in a hung parliament in the middle of a very difficult financial situation, not just in Britain, but across the world with countries like Greece falling over. We've got a coalition signed up to what we would regard as a credible, serious economic plan to deal with our budget deficit. And that was the big prize. And I think the only question people had was, is it going to endure? Is it going to last? Is it all going to fall apart later this year? But which is why we kind of rushed later in the months that followed to put the economic parts of the coalition agreement into legislation through budgets and spending statements.
I think that's all true. And the reason why Vince Cable couldn't be in any of the talks was because he totally disagreed with that strategy, whereas it turned out that
I don't think he did totally disagree. I had a good relationship with Vince Cable. Everyone always thought I had a rather tetchy one. I didn't. He was very important because actually without his support, I couldn't do anything as Chancellor later. Chris Huhne was much more difficult. Chris Huhne was the person at the time who most vociferously objected, but basically got overruled. Vince Cable, the only thing he wanted was a commitment that it wasn't all public expenditure cuts, that there were tax rises as well. And he signed up to an increase in VAT and an increase in capital gains tax was his demand. So, that was the composition of the public expenditure tax squeeze was where they did have an influence, but they did not have an influence on the overall path.
As you say.
And they could have. It's interesting,
it was the price they paid to be in the cabinet, is the truth. And dumping on Labour and playing into this kind of nonsense that it was Labour's public spending plans which caused the global financial crisis was something that they did. And that is the thing I think which kind of winds up Labour people, because we think,
I can tell.
Have a bit of principle, for God's sake.
Still raw all these years later. Now listen, what about...
Of course it's still raw, because it was,
They didn't really have a choice.
It was the last time we were in government.
Yeah, but Cameron had won.
Government. They had to go into government. I don't criticise them that at all.
And do you agree? Here's a good question, because this is one that's relevant to the future. I think they were right to choose a coalition rather than a supply and confidence arrangement. So the supply and confidence arrangement, just to remind people, is that you will pass a budget, you'll support a budget, and you won't vote against the government in a no confidence arrangement, but you don't join the government. You're just another party in parliament that's not going to bring the government down. But, to me, you sign up to all of the kind of pain of supporting the government because your opponents say, well, why are you not bringing this government down? Why are you not kicking them out? Why are you not joining us in the voting lobbies against their budget without any of the benefits? Whereas the full coalition meant that, look, Vince Cable, Nick Clegg, Chris Huhne, Danny Alexander, Ed Davey were the most powerful, most influential Liberals there have been in British politics since Lloyd George, since the beginning of the 20th century.
I totally agree. And a coalition was the right thing for them to do. And they had to go into government at that time because things were going to be unstable with a hung parliament. So I don't criticise them for that. I do think they massively underestimated their power. I mean, the truth was they didn't get any of the big officers of state. Nick Clegg made himself much less relevant than he should have done. And they were
powerful inside the government. We'll talk about this as, I'm sure in a future episode, but fundamentally, the government was driven by something called the Quad, which was me, Danny Alexander, Nick Clegg, and David Cameron, and that's where all key decisions were made. And they did veto things. They did. We were actually remained a remarkably confidential government, so that didn't always come out. But I think people underestimate their power. Danny, of course, referred in the conversation we've just had to the fact they did pay a very heavy political price because they got wiped out.
And it was quite interesting. I thought you actually looked rather shocked when he said that Ed Davey would not want to do a similar kind of coalition deal if the opportunity arose in the general election if there was a hung parliament, because it was like you were thinking, well, why wouldn't you? But clearly Danny Alexander had a different take on Ed Davey.
Well, I think the most interesting kind of news for today's politics, is if Danny's right, that Ed Davey doesn't want to do a coalition with Labour. I mean, we already know Ed Davey says he doesn't want to do a deal with the Conservatives. And our whole conversation with Danny Alexander shows the value for the Liberal Democrats of being able to say, well, we might go with the other side. If all of the conversation we've had was you and me explaining why we had to offer things to the Liberal Democrats to stop them getting into bed with the other party. So if Ed Davey's just saying, I won't do a deal with the Tories, he's throwing away all the leverage that you've just heard Danny Alexander had during those talks and Nick Clegg. But second, what if he's not going to have a coalition with Starmer? This is in the situation where Labour's got the largest number of seats, largest number of votes, but they haven't got an overall majority. Then, what is Ed Davey thinking of? Is he thinking of a supply and confidence arrangement on Labour? It'll create a pretty weak government because it will kind of live vote by vote, hand to mouth, which is pretty interesting for British politics over the next 5 years. But it seems to me the Liberal Democrats are throwing away, again, that big opportunity to influence things. Maybe they then need to think, is there a way, which many parties in Europe struggle with, for a minority party to do better at the subsequent election? But I personally would think it was pretty crazy to throw away the chance of being in government again.
It goes to those cultural questions, though, about how British government works and how the public perceive it. I mean, in 2010, the only thing more popular than Nick Clegg was the idea of a coalition in the national interest. And by 2015, the only thing more unpopular than Nick Clegg in British politics was the idea of another coalition, because coalition had been seen to be, by very many people, a bad thing, independent of
I'm not sure I agree with you about that. I think the Liberal Democrats made a big mistake in 2015 of saying they might do a deal with Labour, which was not credible. And so people, to keep out Ed Miliband, voted Conservative in Liberal seats. But I think they should have considered, if it had been possible and if the Conservatives could have agreed, to run again as a coalition. I think the concept of the coalition was still quite popular in 2015. And you could have said, job not done. But anyway, that
feels like a discussion for another day. I think the only other thing I'm going to say from a lessons point of view is that in politics, of course, winning is the most important thing. But because it's a dynamic game and you always have the chance to come back, you can lose well or you could lose badly. I think looking back on this, I think there was a real risk that Labour could have lost this election badly if we had got into some kind of messy, unsustainable relationship with the Liberal Democrats in 2010. I think Labour would have fallen apart. It wouldn't have lasted. And actually the long-term damage for Labour would have been very substantial. We played an important public service by allowing you to reach a coalition with the Liberal Democrats and kind of giving you a bit of cover for 2 or 3 days. I'm not sure whether...
That's not how it felt at the time. It didn't feel like you were doing us a great public service.
I'm not sure whether Rishi Sunak would do the same thing, because I think that it's very risky in our system. Gordon Brown took a big hit by being seen as the squatter, Labour clinging on to power. Unless you have rules which make it possible and legitimate, the truth was, George, you wanted us to be there while you negotiated with the Liberal Democrats, while simultaneously saying from Friday, Gordon Brown is illegitimate and should go now. And that is I think there was a real danger of losing badly.
I think you raise a really interesting point, which is it didn't feel like that at the time. Honestly, we just wanted Labour out and us in. Yeah. But I think those 5 days, which were only possible because Gordon Brown remained, did give us 5 days in which to create a stable coalition government. And I think if Gordon Brown had walked out on Friday morning, immediately after the election...
Which is what you were wanted.
Which was what we were calling for and what we wanted. We would have been plunged into a minority government trying to negotiate a coalition from office. It's an interesting question, therefore, in the kind of Conservatives' interest. If they think there's no prospect of a deal with the Liberal Democrats in that situation, do you just go on the night? I think there's general lessons here, though, for Starmer and for Labour, which is respect for the Liberal Democrats. You can't do a deal with people who you regard as sort of...
However hard you find it.
You can't think of them as sort of traitors to the progressive cause. You've got to respect them. You've got to do the preparation now, bother to read their manifesto, work out the policies that they feel strongly to rather than being dismissive about them, deal with the party leader. I think throughout this there's a lesson, which is they're trying, Gordon's trying to go round Nick Clegg, and the party leader is the key person to engage with. And then try and keep the unity of your party, because what sort of is fatal for Labour in this period is that there are lots of Labour voices such as yourself saying, hold on, this thing's not going to work, whereas Cameron's able to command the majority of his party. Yeah. Now, that, of course, was partly because we were all very keen to get into office. But I think there are some really good lessons here, and hopefully this will...
The only thing I'd say is those are the lessons you'd learn if you were the opposition party trying to get into government, and all those things you've just said are completely the right way to think about it. If you are the Conservatives in 2010, I'm not sure if you are the incumbent party after 13 years in government, they are necessarily the right lessons. And I think if you want a better outcome next time around, or even the same outcome, then the thing which you need right now is the Cabinet Secretary talking to the party leaders about whether there are arrangements to legitimise this process, because actually, if it's being seen to be illegitimate from the first hours, it's actually really hard to stay in it. And maybe next time around, Rishi Sunak will decide it's not for him. So there we are. We're done. That was our first ever deep dive, our Inside the Room historical episode. And I enjoyed it, although it's quite draining.
Well, we've come up for air from our deep dive now. Listen, we want to say a big thank you to you, Danny, for joining us, our first guest in the studio. And I think he really entered into the spirit of the conversation, which was terrific. We should also, I think, thank Sky and the BBC, because we used quite a lot of their archives, and there were a lot of reporters working equally hard during those 5 days in May, all those years ago.
There were, and would love to hear from you. What did you think? Did you enjoy that? Are there other big political events which you would like us to deep dive into? If we do another Inside the Room episode, which is the particular political period you'd like us to examine, let us know by getting in touch at questions@politicalcurrency.co.uk. Love to know your ideas. I mean, what do you think? What do you fancy deep
Well, we could do,
into?
This will be a real trauma for me. We could do the Brexit referendum, Scottish independence referendum, which was really interesting.
I think 9/11 is a hugely important day which shapes things.
I was a backbench MP at the time. It's absolutely seared in my memory, of course, like everyone else. There's the financial crash.
Bank independence.
Lots of...
the day you went to the Olympics?
Well, I think we've already covered that. Haven't we?
Okay, well, I'm just saying maybe that wouldn't be a deep dive. That would be like a shallow little paddle. I'd like to do that again, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I really enjoyed doing that. Hopefully you all did who are listening to this. But we're going to be getting back to normal business next week.
See you next week.